what adopted was. You would never think to figure out what adopted is, because one, you're Filipino, so growing up in the Philippines, adopted is not the word they use. But I also didn't understand what ampon meant. I connected it with, okay, so my aunt said that I have a dad in Canada, so that means that I'm not part of this family, so they call me ampon. Yeah. But my understanding is it's just because they're not my circle of family. My dad, right, is in Canada, but it didn't make sense to me that I wasn't blood related when they would use that term.
Got
And
it.
so it
Okay.
didn't make sense. Like, why did you bring me here? Why did I have to be here if you didn't actually want to take care of me? So I spent a lot of time just internalizing all of it and not actually processing it in a healthy way, because there was nobody I could have a conversation about this with. Go back to any of it. It was like me going into foster care was a way for me to leave all of it. And then I decided I wanted the social worker to write up the paper, the document to get me emancipated from my dad's care. I was emancipated from his guardianship.
So how did the legal adoption come into place?
There was no question, because in my birth certificate, in the records that the government would have here, I'm naturally his child.
Okay.
So my documents doesn't state anywhere that I'm adopted. It just says that he's my dad and my mom is dead.
So
And
falsified records.
yeah, pretty much. So I don't know who I was. I don't know who the person is on the paper. Everything was falsified. My mom's name, um, there was a midwife's name there that I had eventually researched, as I did end up going to search for my biological parents. Yeah, the things that I found out from that birth certificate was completely all wrong. And there was no way of me trying to figure out like who I was. You know, I know what it's like to register a birth certificate. I have 3 children. In that birth certificate, you put the color of their hair, what they weighed, what their eye color was, who are their parents, what the address is. All of these things would be on your birth certificate. My birth certificate barely had anything in it, and it was like a scanned piece of paper. And that was the copy that I had, that I wouldn't get until I was 27. So I didn't find out the story of how I was adopted until I was 23 or 24 years old. And that was the first and the last time I ever heard of the story. And I don't even remember the entirety of it, because my dad just started kind of talking about it out of nowhere while I was writing a paper. I was in college, like, mid writing a paper. And he just was sitting beside me having a coffee and decided to just start telling me some sort of story. And like you're half listening, you're not really listening. And you're just like, yeah, some child was crying. And you're just like, yeah, okay. And then it wouldn't kick in until later that you're just like, wait, what is that story about? And he's just like, it's about you. And I'm like, oh, what? Like, I barely heard any of it, but that's what it was. Like, the story would be told. I didn't know the story until I was 23 or 24. That was the very first time my dad had ever spoken to me about anything that had to do with being adopted.
Wow.
And it was
Why
very
did he wait
casual.
till that long?
I think because I was talking to him about doing some sort of like family tree for a project, because I
Mm,
went to school for education, right? So those things, to understand children, family, you have to do kind of like projects like that, right? So I guess like maybe I had brought it up and I said I was doing a family tree, or I'm doing some sort of genealogy thing. And maybe we were having a conversation about his family, and then he started talking about it. I don't remember how we even started talking about it, but I just don't remember. Like, I just remember not even really listening to him, because it was so casual in the way that he brought it up. that I missed that he was even talking, that he said that, oh, it's about you, you know? And it's really strange because it's almost like we just went on years before that, kind of just like, okay, we're playing pretend here. And then there's this like important moment where he would tell me who I was or where I came from. But then it was so casual that I wasn't even listening because I was busy doing a paper. And then a few years later, at 27, is the first time I would see my birth certificate for the very first time at 27 years old.
Your Philippines actual birth certificate?
Yeah, it was the record that he has. And he gave
Wow.
it to me. And the reason he gave it to me was because I was applying for a passport. I had never applied for a passport before. After I came here, my dad did all that. So then I was finally 27 years old with 2 children. I had just had my second child. And then I was applying for a passport. So I needed my birth certificate and I needed all of my documents that my dad had up until that age, like my citizenship. He had carried all of this the entire time. I had never had, like, but I never had these documents in my hand before. So I was 27 years old, the mother of 2. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, can I have these documents? Because I need to apply for a passport. And he's like, yeah, sure, pick it up. It was the first time I ever saw the passport
Wow.
that I had from the Philippines. Um, it was the first time I'd ever seen my birth certificate. And remember, my mom was 26 years old, turning 27 when she had me. And I wouldn't see her name until I was 27 years old. And that name would actually be false. That name would actually be
Wow.
not even her. Her name and her last name in the paper was right, but the middle name was wrong.
So let's kind of talk about this because you're a mom and I'm not yet a mother, but I've always been curious as to when adoptees create their own family and they are finally in connection with a blood relative. How do you share that experience with your husband and your kids? How has that impact you in terms of what family means to you?
I had no idea what family meant. When I was just dating my husband, I didn't even really think we were going to be together. I understood nothing about relationship. I didn't know you were supposed to last in relationships. I knew nothing about relationships in general. I thought you like somebody, you chill, you hang out. That was my idea of a relationship with a boy, was that we would hang out. And again, because I wasn't very girly, it was kind of just like we were buddies. You know what I mean? Like, I became friends with his friends. So we would just all hang out, we would drink, we would smoke, we'd watch movies. It wasn't so serious. So it didn't even kick in right away. Whatever, like we didn't even know when we started dating because we were just friends at first. And then I had no idea what a relationship was. I had no idea what a family was. I had no, up until the day that I found out that I was pregnant, I was just waiting for the day that I was going to die. Like I accepted it and I was ready for it. I have been doing, you know, I smoked marijuana. I took ecstasy. I've tried drugs that affected my weight, took me to the emergency a few times. I thought that I was done. Like how my life was going, I knew how to make money. I knew how to survive. I knew how to pay for the things that I had. I knew how to afford the drugs and the alcohol, but I didn't know how to live long or like stay until the future, have a future. I lived for the day that I was living. And if I was alive today, that's great. I don't know what it's going to be like tomorrow, if I'm going to wake up or if I'm going to be too high or if I'm going to be in the emergency. But whatever it is today, I'm having a good time and that's it. And I remember finding out that I was pregnant and I had no idea what it meant. I had no idea what it meant that I was pregnant. I remember going to the walk-in clinic because I had been so sick. I couldn't, keep food down. Um, that's how oblivious I was to anything that had to do with growing up or life. I didn't know what was going on with me. I just thought I had like some sort of, stomach flu. I couldn't finish a whole cigarette anymore. It was making me sick. I was so dizzy, um, because I was anemic and I hadn't been eating and I was puking a lot. And I didn't know that any of those symptoms was because you were pregnant. And I worked 6 to 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts. I just knew how to make money and survive. Anytime I got sick, I didn't understand what was happening to me. If I was really, really like to the end of the line, that's probably the only time I'd go to the hospital. And that's what I did. I went to the walk-in clinic because I had just been so sick I could no longer stand up. And I finally went to the doctors, and the doctor's like, okay, what are you feeling? And then I told him, and then he goes, okay, I need you to pee in this cup, and we're going to take a pregnancy test. And I said, what is that? To see if you're carrying a child. How do you carry a child? Well, are you trying to get pregnant? And I was like, I don't know what that means. No, and he's just like, okay, well, we'll figure it out. You go, pee in this cup and come back. So I peed in the cup. I came back to the office and I sat there, and he dipped that stick in there and he goes, congratulations, you are going to be a mom. And I sat there and I said, as a doctor, it's illegal for you to lie to a patient. And he was like, I'm not lying. Why would I lie to you? And I was shocked. I didn't know what that meant, that I was going to be a mom, that I was pregnant. So I left the office. I went to husband and I said, I'm pregnant. And he was like, I know. And I was like, what did you know? Because the entire time that I was sick, he kept saying, I think you're pregnant. And I was just like, okay, whatever. I don't know what that means. And then he was like, okay. And in that moment, I think if I hadn't gotten pregnant, I wouldn't have survived. It was the thing that saved me, literally. Because in that moment, I had to make a decision like, I don't know, maybe it was just the instinct that kicked in, the maternal instinct, or I'm not really sure what kicked in at that time. But I remember telling myself, like, well, I have to do everything in my power to keep this whatever thing safe. Like it was a part of me. It was the only person biologically related to me that was going to be here. And I had to do whatever it took to protect it. And I even told like my husband, my boyfriend at the time, like, I don't need you here. I can do this on my own. Like, I just wanted it to be my child and myself. I think that's what I was feeling. I just didn't want it to. I felt like growing up, I had to share everything about who I was with everybody else and be everything else for everyone else. And then now that I'm having this thing that was, physically connected to me, I wanted to protect it and just be us. I wanted to shield it from everything else that was bad that I've gone through, that I was, the family that I had. Um, and also I had to think about like my husband at the time. He was like, his life was going to change. Well, I can figure this out. I figured out everything else in my life. I can figure it out. I don't need him. And that's what I said to him. But, obviously he stayed. Um,
An
but
angel.
right? Like, how dare you say all these things to me? But it wasn't until he came out that really made things real. And I just remember the moment that I was giving birth to him, it was such a traumatic experience as well, because I was very sick when I was in labor. I was like, I had a fever, and it was affecting him while he was still in there. And I remember him coming out And like, I remember in my head, like screaming for my mom to come and like my dad to come, like, because it was that moment where I felt like I wasn't going to survive it because I had super high fever. They tried to get my fever down because it was affecting the baby. My blood pressure was going up and it just felt like I was dying. And I was just like, the only thing that I want was my parents, my real parents, to be here before I die. Because then my child is going to be left with no one from my side. And then when I first held my son, it was like full circle. Um, Everything about being a child, going through life alone, it changed and it now became, how do I love this child and how do I raise him to never experience the things that I went through? And it's that fear and that constant worry, when you become a parent, that kicks in. And that, and I think I would experience postpartum depression and anxiety, but I didn't know it at the time. I wasn't diagnosed until well after my third child, years later. Um, but yeah, like it was so weird transitioning from being the only person in the world to like now having a child that you had to protect and take care of. And it was a really challenging experience because I had never taken care of a baby before. I don't even remember myself as a baby. Like I don't know what having a baby was like or what it's supposed to be like. What are you supposed to do? My husband knew everything from how to change diapers to how to change his clothes. I couldn't even do those things because I felt like I was going to hurt him every time I picked him up. So for a long time, I didn't know how to do any of it. And I didn't have sort of that nurturing instinct, or at least I thought I didn't have that nurturing instinct of what a mother is supposed to be like because I never grew up with one. So I didn't know how it was supposed to be. I felt like I was playing house. I was just making sure that this was it was a real baby, that I wasn't going to drop the baby. I was going to make sure that whenever it cried, I gave it a bottle. You know what I mean? Like it was just like as pure and simple as it could get. Well, when a baby cries, you change a diaper, you give it a bottle, you make sure you put it to sleep, you pat it, whatever it was. But it never connected on that, like, I'm a mother. This is what you're supposed to do. I don't think none of it made sense. None of it made sense to me.
How do you share about your adoption experience with your family, with your kids and your husband? Do you talk about it with them?
I had never talked too much about it up until I decided to explore what that meant at 29 years old. So my son is already like, almost 10 years old, maybe. Um, I didn't, I never talked about it. Even my husband, now that we can talk about it, because he now knows about it, for the first several years of our relationship, I never talked about it. I never told him I was adopted. I didn't tell him anything about what that was like or what it meant or none of it. I didn't talk about it because I didn't understand it to talk about it. Um, and it wasn't until I was 29 when I would start opening up about it because that was a very important year for me. I had just prior to doing that, a couple of years or a year and a half before, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression and anxiety. And it had gotten so bad. And I remember seeing a therapist, and the first thing that she said to me was, because I asked, how do you get this? How do you get postpartum depression? Is it just because you had a baby? And she said, no, sometimes you're more susceptible to getting um, postpartum depression because it's one, either hereditary, or two, um, you have some sort of trauma from your childhood, and it manifests into your adulthood in however way, and it happened to manifest as postpartum depression for you. And it wasn't until that moment that I was like, wow, the only way I could beat this thing is to figure out everything from the past, to understand any of the trauma. Like, I didn't even know what trauma was, like, we're Filipinos. Okay, well, for me and my family, how I grew up, there's no such thing as mental health. There's no such thing as trauma. There's no such thing as bullying. There's no such thing as, you being treated demeaningly. Like, there was no such thing as that. It's like you just learn to live and survive in the family that you have, in however way they treat you mentally, physically, emotionally, and that's just that. But whether you're experiencing some sort of abuse, my dad never physically abused me, but I will say that the emotional, mental, verbal abuse that I experienced growing up in his family was very deep. And I didn't understand how I was going to do any of it, come out of the fog as an adoptee, until I was 29 and I said, I'm going to go figure this out. And I purchased the Primal Wound book on Amazon. And then I read part of the book because it was a heavy book to read.
It is.
But it opened up so many things for me that finally made sense. And I think that's why they call it coming out of the fog, right? And then I remember the very first adoptee that I ever met online was Ferreira Swan. I don't know if you remember, if you've ever had a conversation with her, but she's a Filipino adoptee, but she's adopted into a Chinese family. So I had just happened to stumble upon all of her posts on Facebook. And I think at that point, I was trying to find the resources to start learning about, like what any of this means. And she was the first person that I found. And every single post that she had, I went through, and it was spot on every single time. And I had never felt so validated in my life before, until that moment, until that book, until that year. 29 was the year for me when I finally said, okay, I'm going to go face all of that thing in the back of my head, in the deepest of my heart that I had never really dealt with. And we're going to figure it out. And that's where it started.
Is this where you started with your advocacy? You have like your own platform and where you talk about this very experience. Is this where it kind of started, or how did that start?
I don't think I did advocacy until much later into my search.
Okay.
So I started a Facebook page for my search. And then I decided I was going to start a new platform on Instagram that only dealt with this, because, as you know, as an adopted person, having social media that shares with like your relatives and your family friends and people you grew up with and your old friends that know nothing about you being adopted, it's very scary to share about it on that personal level. And I wasn't ready for it.
Very.
I wasn't ready for it. I didn't know how to. I was very scared to do it. So I made up an entirely new account called Black Sheep Mars. I figured it was like, incognito, like I wasn't going to be found by my relatives. And it was where I would put everything from. Actually, I started it to process my own thoughts as I went through the search and as I went through this coming out of the fog thing. It was the platform, instead of having my little diary in my journal to write on. I had wanted to process the things that I was going through as I went through this journey. And I wanted to have a cap of the things that I could say, so that it would say, okay, that's enough. You said what you said, and then read through it. So that page was, it still is sort of just my way of processing through things. I don't really post for people or other people. And, the majority of the people that follow me on there are adoptees, and there's a lot of um, potential adoptive parents, but I've kind of also put a halt on that and changed my privacy to, not public, because I was getting a lot of hate stuff. And it was a page for me to just process my feelings and my thoughts and my experiences, you know, from the beginning to today. Um,
Have you
and to,
found that helpful processing this out through your Instagram and all these posts? How has that helped you just internally, mentally, emotionally?
well, like I said, I've always written, and I think writing these things down, I love storytelling. It's like one of those things that I guess
Natural at?
like it was just a thing that I've always been sort of into since I was a kid, is being able to story tell, because I love stories, I love history, I love all these things that sort of just tell a story. So when I would write these posts, it was to not only read it back to myself as if it was a story, but like also understand the emotions, because I think when you're in it, you don't understand how you're feeling. But once you write them down and you read it back to yourself, you're just like, that's what it is that I'm feeling. And it also it kind of paints like a picture for you in the process of how you're growing as a person, um, how you're developing, in the journey that you're on, and how just things open up for you. Because sometimes when you're in it, you don't see those things. You don't see the changes. You don't see um, the things that you should see, because you're just so into it, right? You're just in there and you're like, yeah, this is what I'm doing, this is how it's going, and yeah, we're here now. But when you read about it, you process it different. It's like somebody else is going through it and you're just like, yeah, I get it, you know. So that's kind of what I use that platform for. um and it has helped in terms of processing my emotions and just learning to understand my own emotions around being adopted, and being able to share freely about those things. Because, like I said, I don't, it wasn't until maybe like a month or so ago that I started sharing on my personal page about being adopted. And the response on that is a whole other thing. But um, I felt safe doing it on that platform, on that page. I felt like it was okay to talk about it. I could be open about it. I could say the things that I want to say and not feel so restricted and limited and sort of, judged. I mean, I was still being judged by like random people that would obviously tell me how ungrateful I was,
Ugh.
um, as an adoptee, and how dare you talk shit about your family. Um, but it is what it is. It comes with the territory, right? You share stuff online, you get people online who has something to say about it, and it was just part of it. um but again, anybody that I come across with, I've had young adoptees message me on that page and say, wow, like what you wrote there is like, it resonates with me. And I think that was the shocking part of the whole thing, was I didn't know that it would. I never wrote any of the stuff or wanted to post any of the stuff for anybody, but like, there are people reading it and people
Yeah.
following it. And then, you get that shock when somebody messages you and go, wow, you articulated everything, of like how I was feeling. And you put words to the things that didn't even make sense to me. So like, I talked to a few like teenagers, adoptees, mostly from the US. And they were just like, whatever you wrote, like that, I'm there. I get it. And, they would ask me questions. And I'm not really seriously into that, or like, I don't know how much I'm actually advocating. Um, but I think my way of trying to advocate is just sharing my experience and trying to uh, open up the conversation about these things that people won't really talk about. Being a Filipino adoptee is very different from being a Korean adoptee, being a Caucasian adoptee from the US, adopted by white people. You know, like all of that is very different. And everybody has a voice and everybody has a different experience. And I think my experience represents Filipinos who are adopted by Filipinos who have never searched and who have no idea where they come from, who they are, and they were raised in another country and they adapted well. They lost their culture in some way. And we're all just lost little babies, you know? And we're just trying to, as adults, trying to navigate it through that now and have a conversation about it. So that's kind of what my page is. Whoever reads it, reads it. Whoever cares about it, cares for it. But at the end of the day, I do it just to really help myself kind of process through it. And along the way, I'm open to having conversations with other people that are adopted. I try to not have conversations with people who aren't adopted because it's emotionally tolling and like just really stressful. So, you know, as you learn to heal through the things that you've gone through, you learn to have boundaries. And I think that's what I stick to is having that boundary from outside people that are not, you know, adopted, and just try not to be affected by it so much, you know. So
Well, I can say, Maria, I really appreciate you coming on board and just sharing your story and sharing your background, because I will say throughout this whole discussion and all the other times we've talked, I'm like this. She is like exactly saying what I think I have felt. And that's why I enjoy talking to you. And I will say, I don't, our stories, our origins may not be the same, but what I find alike in our stories is that they're not the picture perfect stories,
they're
right?
not,
They're
yeah,
not the happily ever after adoption stories. Excuse me. And that is a part of what I talk about. And to have another person also at least being able to sound those verbiage it out, it helps other of us to kind of come out and say, you know what, this is exactly how I felt. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for just putting it out there. This is really what Adoptee Cuento Cuento is about, is saying, right, what is our experience? How do we learn from this? And how do we grow from this? And I think throughout this entire discussion, you have shown us that exact journey. So I know it's sometimes telling our journey can be a little traumatic, at the same time healing. So I just really want to
for
say
sure.
thank you for being vulnerable and thank you for sharing with our community. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity, but excited for a part 2 that you're coming on to
Okay.
talk about the reunion, the search and reunion part. And that part, I know a lot of adoptees, like you said, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the people who help a lot. And I think a lot of adoptees have been asking for that and searching for that. So I'm really
Definitely.
excited to have you back on.
Me too. I mean, you know, I don't know how much fire this part one was, but I can definitely say that, like, when we start to talk about this, the reunion and the search portion of my experience, I think that's where a lot of the things unfold. Um, you know, you change from the person of being grateful for the people that took you in, because you're raised to think that way, that you're just indebted forever. But then the moment that you reclaim yourself from the journey of searching and reunion is it's that time when you figure out how to reclaim who you are. And it's really powerful because, um, you know, I think people will get the idea of how this whole entire conversation went. And it resonates with other people, of course, but not everybody searches and not everybody has the opportunity to have a reunion. with the birth family that they lost. And it's in that sort of experience that truly, you know, you go full circle and everything kind of makes sense. And everything that you've ever gone through, it was almost like I needed to get to this spot, to this point. So I'm excited to talk about that part. It's a little bit depressing talking about the prior part, growing up and all of that stuff. And I think it's like that kind of, that those stories are very hard to talk about because you're doing it from when you were a child. And as an adult looking in to that story, it hurts. You feel it 10 times more. But then there's a good part at the end of it. You find the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a really long tunnel, but we make it to the end of the tunnel.
Great.
So
Well, I'm excited to hear about that part too. So definitely stay tuned for later on in the season, and Maria will be back on. I kind of have one last question for you for folks who do want to connect with you. How can they connect with you either on any platform?
I think the platform that I use the most is my Instagram. And it's Black Sheep Mars with 2 A's, that I mostly use to talk to any other adoptees. And the reason why is because I want to make sure that I separate the two from each other, because sometimes we make a mistake of typing in things in the wrong boxes with the wrong people, and just to keep it safe and not just for me but for other people, to have a safe environment where they can have these conversations and we can open up about these things. I use mostly Black Sheep Mars, and so that's on Instagram.
Okay, great. We do have sometimes a fun question that we throw out there to our guest speakers. Is there anything that you've been binging on lately? Could be food, watching anything.
I clearly binge on food, but no. uh Honestly, I'm a dork and I don't really watch too much TV. I don't know the last time I watched a series, but I don't even know the last thing I watch. I don't really watch a lot of TV because I have children and they mostly use a TV. Um, I just watch a lot of documentaries about history. Um, if it's really boring. So I just go
I love
online.
those.
I
That's
go
not
online.
boring to me.
I go online and I read about, academic research on like things that happened in the past, about, you know, um, the last thing that I read about was a bunch of mummies being found in Egypt. Um, and that was that, like I wanted to
Love
find
it.
out, like, okay, did they dig this up and they opened this thing up? And here we go. We have another pandemic. That's the last thing I read about.
Awesome.
Um, and the majority of the time I write. I do a lot of writing to contribute to the memoir. So that's what I do on my off time. That's what I binge do.
Awesome. I cannot wait to hear more about the memoir in your future endeavors. So definitely will be staying tuned. So just
Thanks,
want to
Jade.
say thank you again, Maria, for coming on. And thank you again for definitely coming back for our part 2. So I'm really excited. And if folks want to visit her work, we'll have in our show notes, and as well in our below in our YouTube description, we'll have her Instagram, so you can visit her there. So I just want to say thank you, Maria, and definitely stay tuned for the next episode of our Adoptee Cuento Cuento.
Thank you.
Paalam.
Bye.